Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Jennings, and today I am presenting my talk on overcoming imposter syndrome. A special thanks to the IGDA Bipoc group for inviting me to create this talk. So, who am I? Before I even get into this conversation, I'm a gameplay engineer too, working at Alchemy Labs currently. Alchemy Labs creates Job Simulator, Rick and Morty VR, and Vacation Simulator, among other titles. I'm a software engineer of over 12 years with over 3 dozen shipped projects under my belt. I'm formerly the CEO of Weird Kid Studios and creator of a game called Galactic Bar Fight. It was a VR indie game that I created on the Oculus Quest with a small team, and it had over 17,000 total downloads to date. I've experience working in games, automotive research, and virtual production. I used to work at a studio called Mind Show that created music videos using Unity. I'm also the director of education within the Black and Gaming organization. I've been featured on over 12 gaming podcast episodes, whether in a conversational manner or to give lectures. I also have 2 published essays and am quoted in a recently released book called Great Games Need Great Leaders. And Despite all of my accomplishments and industry experience, I struggle with imposter syndrome. Sometimes it's a little bit more momentary, other times it's a lot more perpetual. But essentially every time I'm approached with a new big endeavor, task, or project, I'm overwhelmed. I wonder if I can deliver, and I wonder if I've been faking my way to my current position. And much like these gifts, I feel like a fraud sometimes, and I always wonder if I'm going to be exposed as being an imposter who's sitting on a throne of lies. And so, Before we really kind of dive in and dissect imposter syndrome, let's ask ourselves, what is imposter syndrome? The Oxford Dictionary describes it as the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own effort or skills. And It's important to consider that word persistent is important, and I highlighted just because it's important to remember that everybody has bad days, everybody has a crises of confidence. That's not at all unusual. It's the persistent inability to believe in your success that makes it imposter syndrome, and not just feeling a bit down that day. And so, as we talk about imposter syndrome, let's actually walk through what does imposter syndrome sound like and look like? Like, how does it tend to generate? What kind of internal dialogue does it tend to generate within us? And some of the phrases you'll hear, see, express when you're dealing with imposter syndrome are, "I'm a fraud." "I'll never be good enough to deserve this." "I'm not as talented as they think." "I don't want to ask questions because it will show how little I know." "I'm not capable of doing this." Everyone here is so much smarter than me. And lastly, "I'm not worthy of my success." You can really hear and read how all of these statements are really devaluing, and they attack your personal sense of accomplishment and competence. An important aspect to also understand about imposter syndrome is that it's cyclical and repetitive, and the cycle goes kind of like this. We have a new project or task that pops up. Oftentimes in games, it's a new game or maybe a new feature that you're in charge of, what have you. You experience a bout of anxiety, procrastination, or over preparation. You get really nervous about your ability to accomplish the next task, and you kind of become paralyzed at the thought of not being able to deliver. Then our next step in the cycle is that the project is completed. We have a brief relief and a sense of accomplishment. I kind of think about this as like, whew, I'm so glad that that's over. And then that leads into our next step of the cycle, which is rationalization. And we start to think, I was lucky, or that somebody else would have done a better job. we really start to attack our role in the completeness of the project or the fact it got out the door. And then we move into the next step. Think about this. We've just completed a project. We just managed to somehow escape by the hair of our skin. And then that leaves us with an increased sense of self doubt. We have more anxiety. And then we feel like a fraud after we've already delivered something. And then that cycles right back into our new task and making us wonder if we could somehow pull this fraud miracle again. And in addition to understanding that imposter syndrome is cyclical, Dr. Valerie Young of the Impostor Syndrome has identified 5 types of imposters, their focus, and what makes them feel vulnerable. And so we're going to check a little bit into her findings. And so looking at the chart, people who feel like imposters hold themselves to unrealistic, unsustainable standards of competence. In Dr. Valerie Young's research, with hundreds of thousands of people from a wide range of occupations and at all phases of their careers, 5 different types emerged, each with its own unique focus. And so I'm going to go through the different types of imposters, kind of how they function, and then basically their core weakness or the area that causes them to feel the most incompetent when dealing with their own imposter syndrome. And so our first imposter is the perfectionist. Their primary focus is on how something is done, how the work is conducted, and how it turns out. They are very dialed into all the details, how something's accomplished, and how it gets out the door. And with that comes the challenge that one minor flaw in an otherwise stellar performance or receiving a 99 out of 100 review in terms of their competence in delivering something equals failure and shame. And essentially the idea is, like, if you think about it, the perfectionist is so focused on getting things out in a flawless manner that when somebody critiques them or has any kind of criticism or comments on how to improve, it's a real blow to their confidence. The next type of imposter is the expert. The knowledgeable version of the perfectionist. Their primary concern is on what and how much they know or can do. I think these people like to imagine themselves as archives for the team and a center point for knowledge in terms of how to accomplish things within the team or environment. And their challenge is that because they expect to know everything, even a minor lack of knowledge brings them a sense of failure and shame. When your pride is in knowing everything, having small bits of knowledge that maybe are beyond your awareness, starts to make you devalue your entire sense of knowledge. The next kind of imposter is the soloist. And the soloist cares mostly about who completes the task. The soloist wants to go in and complete things by themselves without much support at all. And their challenge is that because they think they should be able to do everything on their own, any sense of needing help, tutoring, or coaching is a sign of failure that evokes a sense of shame within them. The next type of imposter is the natural genius. And the natural genius also cares about how and when accomplishments happen, but for them, the competence is measured in terms of how easy and how quickly they get things done. And so I've struggled with this myself when sometimes I've programmed for so long, sometimes having to review documentation about a really simple function that I've used 1,000 times. It kind of can be a blow to my ego in terms of having to go back and research and understand this library or tool that I already have experience in, but having to relearn almost feels like I clearly didn't know enough, and it makes me feel like a fraud. And so the challenge for them is the fact that they have to struggle to master a subject or skill, or that you're not able to bang out your masterpiece on the first try equals failure, which evokes a sense of shame. And then the next one is the superhuman. The superhuman measures their competence based on how many roles they can juggle and excel in. And this person is somebody who is the eternal plate spinner. They think they can do all the things all the time. And their core challenge is that falling short in any role, whether as a parent, a partner, on a home front, in terms of on a project or a team, failing as a friend or a volunteer, all these evoke a sense of shame because you feel that you should be able to handle it all perfectly and easily without any kind of struggle. Um, and While we've explored the different types of imposters, um, we've dissected what imposter syndrome is. We've dissected the cycle of imposter syndrome. We've now identified the 5 types of imposter syndrome. And so now let's talk about how do we actually improve our imposter syndrome. Um, and We're going to be using a strategy following a detailed that's detailed in the book Own Your Greatness by Dr. Lisa and Richard Orbe. And one of the strategies they detail in terms of tackling your imposter syndrome is called the 3 C's. And I like to think of this as our imposter syndrome attack plan. And so the 3 C's are broken up into 9 total steps. This graphic is a little confusing, but we read it from the bottom up. We'll cover 3 different phases of tackling your imposter syndrome, which are the clarifying, choosing, and creating stages, each of which is itself comprised of 3 individual steps. So let's get into how we actually overcome our imposter syndrome. And so the first C is our clarifying stage. And we want to understand, at its core, we want to understand where these feelings of being an incompetent imposter even come from. Um, the thing to remember is that when we clarify we're clarifying because we often repeat negative stories to ourselves about ourselves, and we don't usually allow ourselves the ability to internalize our feelings of success, which is why we're always burdened by this sense of anxiety, the sense of being a fraud, this sense of incompetence. And so our goal is to understand the fundamentals of our own imposter syndrome and tell ourselves a different story about our competence, about our abilities, about our ability to function and deliver. Um, and so the first thing we want to do when we're clarifying our imposter syndrome is we want to identify our origin story. And when we're identifying our origin story, we want to ask ourselves some questions. Firstly, when did you first become aware of feeling like an imposter? What was a situation in which you felt insignificant or incompetent? Um, we also want to ask ourselves, do you have a sibling or a family member who is designated the smart one? That kind of created a value system that either taught you to devalue your ability, your skills, your competence. You should also ask yourself, did your parents convince you that you were superior or inferior to other people? Again, kind of skewing your value system for yourself very early. And lastly, we want to ask ourselves, is achievement, whether in academic or professional settings, highly valued within your family? All this with our goal being to figure out where our negative internal narrative began. I can personally share that for me. I grew up in a Black household, and one of the things that my mom always instilled in me when I was very young is that we have to work twice as hard and expect half as much. And I think with that knowledge, with that statement kind of always echoing through my life, I think it's always created a sense of incompetence within me because it feels like even when I've done everything I can, it's still not enough, even if everybody around me is perfectly satisfied. And so it's important to ask ourselves these questions, and I hope you are able to clarify your own origin story in terms of your imposter syndrome. Um, and then next, when we're in this clarifying phase for our imposter syndrome, we want to begin to understand our triggers, or the text likes to call them our trapdoors. We want to understand the situations in which our vulnerability to imposter syndrome may drastically tick up, because it can allow us to brace for those moments where it occurs, and help us to react in a more beneficial way. And so some common trapdoors and triggers are Being placed in a new situation. For example, if you're promoted to a new position or even land a new job opportunity, the creeping doubts may settle in that you can't handle the new role. Another unfortunate situation that might be a trigger for your imposter syndrome is getting a compliment. Your imposter syndrome might make you disregard the compliment and just assume that the other person is just being nice. You completely deflect the positive remarks and keep yourself from internalizing that you earned that appreciation. And then one of the last, like, really common triggers is you started a new relationship. When starting a new relationship, whether romantic or platonic, you may doubt how much of a new person in your life may values or cares for you. And this also extends to being on a new team within your craft, right? They might tell you how talented you are, and right away you almost feel like you have to prove that you're not a fraud, that you deserve to be there, even if they didn't necessarily pose the idea that they don't believe in your value or competence. Um, and so the last step in terms of the clarifying stage for tackling our imposter syndrome is changing our narrative. And we our internal the issue so we struggle with in terms of imposter syndrome. um, One of the struggles is that our internal dialogue may reinforce that we are a fraud or that we're incompetent. And the only way for us to stay hidden is to overwork, overfunction, and make no mistakes. And it's important that you accept that none of that is true, that you are not a fraud and incompetent, and that your value and that you don't have to stay hidden. And not only do you not stay hidden, that your value isn't just to overwork, overfunction, and make no mistakes in a way to pass off your competence. Like, you are competent. You don't have to overburden yourself to prove that. And so these thoughts keep us trapped and they don't look at our situation through the lens of reality. One way to change our narrative is to write an honest and raw letter to a person or situation that contributed to our imposter syndrome. And then the text recommends that we destroy it so that we can move on with our lives. And if you have anyone in your life that you can actually share the letter with or share the thoughts with, just talk out, the challenges of your narrative or the challenges you had to work through with your imposter syndrome or that situation that created within you. It's for the best to do that, to be able to be open and connect with them in that way, and then you can still destroy the letter afterwards if you'd like. And I like this graphic about reframing our situation, because this is a visual example of changing your narrative through reframing and how we perceive our position or situation. Um, and so, the example we have here is I don't deserve to be here. And I think the correct way to reframe that, if you don't trust yourself, if you don't believe that you deserve to be here, instead, think about I should trust the judgment of those who invited me. If you have any respect for the people who invited you into your position or situation, then understand that your trust doesn't have to be in you. Your trust could be in them and their ability to see the value that you could bring to the team. And then, even better is if you can embrace the statement that I'm here because I earned it, that no one gave you this position, that no one gifted you the opportunity, that no one handed you the ability to succeed. You're here because you earned it, and you should be proud of that. And so, recapping our first phase of clarifying our own imposter syndrome, is that we have to understand that we need to identify where our feelings of being an imposter originated. We also need to understand how our imposter syndrome triggers, and what situations create those feelings. And then lastly, we need to change our narrative. We don't want any more thoughts of we are successful despite how incompetent we are. We didn't look ourselves into being here. We want to reframe our statements, our internal dialogue to say and consider something like we are successful due to all of our hard work and we have overcome challenges in order to ensure that success. You're here because you deserve it. You're here because you worked hard for it. And then this leads into our second C, which is choosing. Um, And our goal of choosing is to make conscious decisions to break the imposter syndrome cycle. And we do this by speaking our truth, recognizing our strengths, silencing negative thoughts, and then overcoming our own perfectionism. And so when we're choosing our, we want to first speak our truth. And kind of leaving off our last point, our first phase was all about focusing on doing the internal work to understand our imposter syndrome. And so following it up, we want in our second phase to vocalize our struggles of imposter syndrome and share our experience of struggle in order to share and destroy that internal narrative by expressing ourselves to people we trust around us. And so when we're speaking our truth, we have to improve how we speak on ourselves privately and publicly. We have to be able to accept compliments. We also have to work on how we receive compliments and do work to share our imposter syndrome with others. It's okay to share that we're struggling, tired, and overwhelmed. One of the largest feelings that come up with imposter syndrome is a sense of isolation. And by being open and vulnerable, we can alleviate and get some support for those feelings. And lastly, we want to share our struggles with someone we trust can help us develop and help us more clearly and honestly evaluate our performance. All of these points lead to hopefully our last conclusion, which is hopefully all of these can lead us to performing more positive self-talk, or at least hearing it from the people we trust around us. Another strategy to choosing how to overcome our imposter syndrome is silencing our ants. And ants stand for our ANTs, and that stands for our automatic negative thoughts. And our ants are the reactionary thoughts that come flooding when our imposter syndrome is triggered. An example of an ant, for example, a thought while struggling is, "What's wrong with me? This should come easy by now." I feel this way all the time when I'm programming something new or writing a new feature for a game. Why is it taking me this long? This shouldn't be that complicated. It seemed so easy when I was first sitting down and thinking about it, right? Another ant example is that the thoughts we have when making a mistake. And an example of that is, "Oh no, everyone saw that. They must be thinking that I don't deserve this opportunity and I'm incompetent." And it's, again, another way of devaluing and almost inflating the perception of our challenge in a situation. And I really enjoyed these thoughts I found while searching for imposter syndrome quotes. Amit Ray, an author, says, "We are not our thoughts. We are the observer of our thoughts." And a way this applies to me is that I had a lead engineer who I told once that I sometimes feel like a failure whenever I screw up on a project. And he told me, "JJ, just because you failed at something, that doesn't make you a failure." And it's very important, I think, to separate the actions you do and your performance from your value as a person, because I think it creates a healthier relationship and allows you to have a stronger sense of self, so that even when you may fail, or you may screw up, or you may have a challenge, you don't conflate your value to your struggle. And so when we're choosing to silence our ants, we want to ask ourselves some questions when those ants pop into our mind. The first question we want to ask ourselves is, what evidence leads me to be so pessimistic of myself? Why do I believe so little in my ability to perform? We also want to ask, when was the last time such a negative prediction about myself came true? I've definitely thought that the sky would be falling if I delivered something incorrectly, or was unable to succeed on a task, and never has my reality matched the catastrophe of my imagination. Another question to ask ourselves is, what is the cost or benefit to labeling ourselves negatively? What good is it to paint ourselves in such a negative light? And then lastly, we want to ask ourselves, what is the data to support my interpretation of what others think of me? I think sometimes when we screw up, we imagine that people view our mistakes under a microscope, and I think a lot of times people aren't thinking about us nearly as much as we think they are. Um, and so, our final step when choosing to overcome and to tackle our imposter syndrome is valuing our self care. Um, and so, um, the when making active decisions to improve our imposter syndrome, we want to invest in self care, and that sounds kind of contradictory. But to feel more valuable at work, we have to uh, we focus on ourselves. But the issue with our so when we struggle at work, the issue is that we focus so much on our deficiencies. But the issue, um, the way to combat that is to actively think about ways to improve our mental and physical states and create better perceptions and relationships with ourselves mentally, physically, and in a reflective manner. And so, our imposter syndrome can affect the way we approach and embrace self care as a practice. um, Self care is not just anything you do for entertainment or relaxation. It is an activity meant to fill your tank and give you a sense of rejuvenation. Self care can be physical, such as massages, exercise, yoga. Self care can also be mental, such as therapy, journaling, talking with mentors. And self care can also be reflective, such as meditation, doing religious practices, and performing gratefulness exercises. It's about hard booking these activities regularly in your schedule so that you are purposely, conscientiously, and consistently filling your tank. Burnout is rampant in the game industry, and we want you to make sure you're nourishing yourself alongside and investing in your creative output. And recapping our second phase of actively choosing to combat our imposter syndrome. We have to make active decisions to treat ourselves better, both externally and internally, while we build a support network around ourselves. It doesn't make you unskilled or incompetent to share that you are nervous, struggling, or intimidated. You need to ask yourself, can you make a mistake and still be valuable? We need to ask ourselves, is anything less than perfection acceptable? And we need to lastly ask ourselves, are we investing in our own self care? Are you giving your mind and body the chance to be restored? And so I really like this is an image depicting what our perception of our knowledge with imposter syndrome is versus our actual knowledge. And I really enjoy it because I think I've definitely felt this way where I know enough to get by, and I oftentimes feel like that's not enough and that everybody around me knows so much more. Um, when in truth, I think that in general, our knowledge is a lot more like this: what others know, which is a little bit, and then we also know a little bit that overlaps with others. Well, we also have our own independent knowledge and contributions, and it's important to see that and appreciate that that you also have knowledge and special skills you supply your team um, when you're combating your imposter syndrome. And so we get to our last C, creating. And so the goal here is we want to focus on creating environments that allow us to move away from our imposter syndrome and allow us for our optimal performance within our work environments. And so one of the best ways to uh, create new environments for our own success is by experimenting with new roles. And so, first, let's recap what old roles and relationships we have as imposters are. I'll read the slide, but when struggling with imposter syndrome, we tend to lock ourselves into roles or dynamics in our relationships out of fear of being exposed as a fraud. These are going to sound really familiar because we just touched upon them. But 5 familiar thoughts of an imposter are the superwoman, superman. I need to do the work of three people. The natural genius, who asks, if I'm truly intelligent, I shouldn't need to work so hard. The expert, who says, I must be the most knowledgeable person at the table. The soloist, who thinks, I can't work with others because if they make a mistake, I will be responsible. And the perfectionist, the person who says, I need to do this perfectly and make no mistakes. And so, to combat our imposter syndrome, we want to enforce vulnerability, we want to be less rigid, and we want to move towards openness by adopting these roles, which are a little bit different than the previous ones. The 5 roles thoughts to fight imposter syndrome are the help seeker, the person who seeks advice and assistance from others. It's okay to ask for help sometimes. The risk taker, the person who learns to take a calculated risk for yourself and for your dreams. Sometimes we're so stifled by not wanting to fail and by this feeling, this sense that we're a fraud, that we close ourselves out of new opportunities. And I think that can limit us in a lot of ways that isn't fair to ourselves. And so that's what the value of the risk taker is, learning to take calculated risks for ourselves and our dreams. And, just exploring those new opportunities, whether we succeed or fail, at least we can say we tried something new. The collaborator, the person who works on team cohesion, combating that sense of needing to be the solo person delivering everything. We also have the knowledge receiver, the person who admits to knowledge gaps and learning and being okay with learning from other experts. Again, it's important to be teachable and available to learn and become better, and being more open to the fact that you could be better and being open to the fact that you want to improve. And then lastly, the visible leader, the person who being open to being more visible and prominent in high stakes situations, which means that you're open to allowing yourself to fail or be observed failing or be observed struggling. A big part of imposter syndrome is wanting to be isolated, and this being a visible leader allows you to combat that actively. And so we want to fight the sense of isolation and fear of being devalued and recognized as incompetent. That requires us to be more open to being seen as flawed, sharing that we have much to learn, and sharing our progress with our team for them and ourselves. The next step when creating environments for us to succeed is establishing a dream team. Imposter syndrome thrives the most when you feel isolated and alone, so it's important not to face it on your own. You need to build a dream team to support yourself in your imposter syndrome recovery. And so here are a few positions on your imposter syndrome fighting dream team. The mentor, a senior person in career experience, somebody who can share their own experience and challenges they've gone through. The cheerleader, your supportive boost, somebody who's going to root you through whatever the situation is, or celebrate you when you do make a big achievement or accomplishment. The grounder, your go-to for a reality check, the person who can help you calm down and reassess the situation. The action planner, they help create a plan when you have an imposter triggered issue, when you don't believe in yourself and need to know what the next thing to do. An action planner would be really valuable. And then the big picture person, they help put things into perspective. Sometimes the opposite of the action planner, sometimes it's easy to really focus in on a small part of the overall solution, and the big picture person helps us take a step back and get a bigger perspective of the entire situation. One person can fulfill multiple roles, but you want a team with more than one person to build a community of support, not to overburden that one person, and then to allow different people with different ideas to share and be open with you about your struggles and your work through your own imposter syndrome. And then lastly, we want to create conditions for optimal performance. We want to take all the skills we learned today and combine them to create an environment for our most optimal performance. We want to interrupt our old behaviors and thoughts, and we want to thoughtfully implement new behaviors and thoughts within ourselves and applied to our situations. We also want to avoid old behaviors like our ants, our automatic negative thoughts, and we want to make sure we are aware of our situational triggers. We don't want to resign ourselves to just suffer with living with imposter syndrome. That's apparently really common from what the research I read. The way we treat it is to take it head on so that we can live a satisfying and internally celebrated work life. Ultimately, you deserve to be happy with your work. And so, recapping phase three, our goal is to ultimately create new behaviors, relationships, and communities with the skills we've learned to create the best possible environment and mindset to thrive and celebrate all of our hard work and success. And this quote I really enjoyed. It says, "The definition of powerful to me is feeling comfortable in my own skin." And I think that's the perfect way to kind of wrap that up as an entire complete thought. And so, recapping the three C's. Um, our first step is to identify our origin story, to understand where did our imposter syndrome stem from. Next, we want to know our triggers. What causes our imposter syndrome to perk up within us? Next, after that, we want to change our narrative. We want to reframe and reshape how we talk about ourselves and how we visualize the situations that we're in. When actively choosing to overcome our imposter syndrome, we need to speak our truth. We have to be okay with saying that we're anxious, that we're struggling, that we're tired, that we're overwhelmed, that we need some help sometimes. We want to also silence our ants. We need to interrupt those automatic negative thoughts that perk up with active questioning. Why do we feel this way? Is it fair to ourselves to feel this way? Does it improve our situation to let ourselves think and feel this way? Um, then we want to value our self care. We want to make sure we're prioritizing our concerns and our focus on inwardly, so that we can be successful and healthy outside of our work life too. We don't want to be so overwhelmed with our focus on performance improving at work that we neglect who we are. And then lastly, when we're creating a new environment for success with our own imposter syndrome, we want to experiment with new roles. We want to try to ask for help. We want to be visible even when we struggle. We want to be okay. We want to be teachable. We want to be vulnerable. We want to be open. We want to be able to establish our dream team. We want to have a network that we can rely on and connect with to help us see ourselves and see our situations when we struggle. And then lastly, when we're creating, we want to ultimately create conditions for our own optimal performance. We want to make an environment using all of these tools where we feel safe, where we feel comfortable, where we feel like we can be the best us possible. And so, in addition to talking through overcoming our own imposter syndrome, I want to share a few quotes from famous imposters that I observed in my research. And so, first we have Michelle Obama. She's known for being an attorney, an author, a public speaker, and America's First Lady from 2009 to 2017. And she says, "I still have a little imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away. That feeling that you shouldn't take me that seriously. What do I know? I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities, about our power, and what that power is." We also have Dr. Margaret Chan. She's known for being a physician. She led the World Health Organization from 2006 to 2017, and she was the World Health Organization's delegate for the People's Republic of China in that time. And she says, "There are an awful lot of people out there who think I'm an expert. How do these people believe all this about me? I'm so much aware of all the things I don't know." And then lastly, our last famous imposter is Neil Gaiman. He's known for being the writer of Sandman, the comic book, Coraline, Good Omens, and American Gods. All of these stories have been translated to film or TV at one point, so I'm sure you've heard of his work. And he says, "Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to a gathering of great and good people, artists and scientists, writers and discoverers of things. And I felt that at any moment they would realize that I didn't qualify to be there, among these people who had really done things. On my second or third night there, I was standing at the back of the hall while musical entertainment happened, and I started talking to a very nice, polite, elderly gentleman about several things, including our shared first name. And then he pointed to the hall of people and said words to the effect of, I just look at all these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? They've made amazing things. I just went where I was sent." And I said, "Yes, but you were the first man on the moon, and I think that counts for something." And I felt a bit better, because if Neil Armstrong felt like an imposter, maybe everyone did. Maybe there weren't any grown-ups, only people who had worked hard and also got lucky and were slightly out of their depth. All of us doing the best job we could, which is all we can really hope for. And so I say that, and I share those famous imposters to say that at the end of the day, we're all figuring things out. We all have this sense of all these people really seem to have together, and I still have no idea of what's going on. And I think it's important to know that we all feel that way at some point, and you're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with you to feel that way. We all feel a little bit incompetent sometimes. And so I want to thank you for coming and leave you with one final quote from Doctors Richard and Lisa Orbe. They say, when you work as hard for yourself as you do for others, you will be unstoppable. And I think that's an important quote because a big chunk of our imposter syndrome is ultimately trying to prove ourselves and prove our value and prove our competence for other people. And if we could just apply that energy to focusing on us and working hard for us and working hard and making us feel healthy and safe, I think that we'd all be tremendously successful. And I just thought it was a really valuable quote. I want to thank you for attending this talk. I hope you found it valuable. Feel free to contact me at my email or connect with me on LinkedIn. And then I also want to shout out the Impostor Syndrome Paradox. It's a TED Talk by Dr. Lisa and Richard Orbe, and that's what led me to this research. So thank you so much for joining me for today's talk on overcoming imposter syndrome. I hope you found this valuable, and I hope you take care.